So to begin, for my first lighting setup, I used an original 2013 Xbox One. The reason I used this Xbox One is because it's two-tone finish, the glossy dark plastic which absorbs light on the right, and the more matte finished light grey plastic on the left, with a chrome disc tray in the middle which breaks it up quite nicely. And then on the top of the Xbox, this finish is flipped, which I thought would be quite an interesting material on which light could bounce and reflect and refract off of. And I think broadly I was right in that. This was actually the third setup I did. I think it's much stronger than the first one I did, so I've rearranged it to put a better foot forward in this assignment. So, to begin, the way this lighting setup was set up was a Vericam LT with a 35mm lens pointing at an off-kilter Xbox One. To the far left of the setup, about 45 degrees to the left, is a dark blue gel on a velvet. This velvet is about 2 meters in the air, basically touching the ceiling. To the right of that is a Velvet Mini, primary green gel on that, pointing directly parallel to the Xbox One, pointing a green light right into its face. And then to the right of that, this is the first issue I had when doing the setup, was a Congo blue gel on a Velvet Mini. And this was not a part of my plan, but I think it became necessary because myself and Richard did this assignment. We're both on the same course. We did it separately, but we used the same equipment, and we both came to the same conclusion that there's something wrong with the camera. No matter what we did, it refused to accept a white balance at all. We reformatted it, we resetted it, we asked people, we went online. It refused. Even if it let us actually undergo a white balance, it wouldn't change a thing. We changed the Kelvin, we did everything we could, and we decided, both of us independently, that the best way to mitigate this is to A, make the light, the overabundance of blue, the overfondness of blue, motivated to put more blue into our setups, which most of mine already had, so that was no problem at all. And secondly was to increase the intensity of that blue, definitely, so make it motivated. So I have put another blue Congo light there just to separate this blue from being the sort of soft blue that kind of irks of bad white balancing and just not quite getting the Kelvin right, to actually being a serious part of this image all the way through, not just the left hand side. All of it has a deep motivated blue. I think that if anything, that's helped the setup quite a bit. It's just created the point of this setup was to be a sort of battle between blue and red, blue and green, blue receding to green, receding territory to green. And I think the blue being much more intense and much more substantial really helped in that. Another problem I had was with the green gel on the Velvet Mini. It just wasn't powerful enough. It wasn't coming across on camera well enough. So I needed to increase it. I tried turning down the other velvets. I tried pretty much everything under the sun, and the only thing I could do was to introduce a Philips Hue bulb that I had, and I could reproduce the colour of the green, and because it's so intense and so directional and so accurate, I could just place it on the table and it would just help push that green along to give it more of a presence on camera. That's why in front of which is different from my plan, there's actually really a soft green in the bottom left hand side of the frame from the beginning, which I didn't really want. I wanted it to be blue anywhere other than the shadows, but that just creates a kind of glowing effect as it goes in, which is just a side effect of having to use a Philips Hue, which I'm very much fine with. Another problem was just the level of light in the room. I didn't plan on using a Dado light, but I pointed one at the ceiling just to bring up the light levels by 10% or so. Otherwise the details were lost. The Xbox became a bit of a black void. I learnt this from the first setup, the amplifier, which we'll get into later, that you do need to bring up the light levels just to get the details so the blacks aren't crushed. In terms of movement, this was achieved by that velvet on the far left. All I did was make it so it wasn't tight at all, and if I let go it would fall. So I had it on the ceiling and I just slowly loosened my grip so it would fall ever so gradually. And as this angle became lower and lower and lower and more obtuse, the light would start to hit the right hand side corner of the Xbox and create a negative space, a void of blue to the right of the Xbox, and below it where the ridges would cut it off. And that's with the green light, which is much less powerful and much less intense than the blue, would actually be able to have a negative space to live in, and that would create a kind of green mist coming across. And as this shadow grows and grows and grows, the green has more real estate, and and the shop become completely overrun with green, which is the branding colour of Xbox, of course. So, but when the stand reaches the bottom and I've got quite a long shadow, I wanted to make it even longer. So what I did, I pushed the VariCam, the velvet, so it went on two legs and kept pushing and kept pushing, so it was slanted, and so the actual velvet was pointing at the wall, just to reduce as much blue as I possibly could. So this next setup is of the Surface Pro, and this was shot on a VariCam LT with a 14mm lens with the camera quite far back, so to get most of it in frame but still be quite a close-up shot with not much negative space. So that was my plan, and I think I achieved that very, very well, all things considered. The point of this sequence was to have one side of the face completely swallowed in blue, and as stated before, it's very convenient that I wanted blue because the camera had an over fondness for blue, and this really helped, if anything, because it is a really nice rich blue naturally in camera. I wanted one face to be like this, and the cut point, the edge closest to camera is the point where it is red, and it's almost like a streak of red coming off the blue side, like an afterburner effect. They can almost see the light shooting off it. The negative, the shadow is purple. You can see it streaming off, which is exactly what I wanted, and a really nice deep, almost purpley red as well. So, and then I would swivel the surface counterclockwise, in fact clockwise, just so the red would hit that back panel, and this back panel is made of a kind of silvery light grey aluminium, which means it does take on light very well, and as I swivel it, it would become red, and then you have basically the opposite shot where the stand is then in purple again, and just the outside of the frame catches that blue and purple light quite nicely. So the way I achieved this look was having a red gel on a Velvet Mini to the left, quite naturally, and then to the right, the same angle, was a velvet, because I wanted the blue to be, obviously it takes up more space, it needs to be a more powerful light. I used velvet with a dark blue gel. On top of that, I had to use a dado light, which was not on the plan at all, but once again I needed to bring up the light levels in the room. It was just too dark. I just needed to bring it up about 10%, and it really, really helped. There's a nice level of detail, and it's just the other ones I think have a problem, especially the third one, of being too dark and not having enough to grab the attention, not having enough contrast. But this one is probably my favourite one. It's the reason this was the third one I shot, but I put it in second instead of first because I didn't want to peak too early. This is by far my favourite one. On top of that, again, the purple was just not vivid enough for me with the Velvet Mini. I had to include a Philips Hue light again, but again, the red was really easy to imitate. The red was so much more powerful and so much more striking, and was so much more, had more of a presence on the shot, so that really, really helped a lot. So this is the third setup. This is the Yamaha amplifier. This was actually the first one I recorded, but I haven't put it first in the show reel because, to be honest with you, I don't think this is my best foot forward. I think I had a bit of a lack of ambition with this one, being the first lighting setup, motivated light setup I've ever done. I think this one was really just getting to terms with the lights and coming to terms in my own home with recording and just getting comfortable with it, because I think even by the second and third, the Xbox and the Surface, I had improved significantly with what I was willing to do. In retrospect, I wish I'd done a bit of camera movement, having the camera at a high angle, slowly going down to meet the face of the amplifier, would have just made it a little bit more visually interesting. Because right now, even though it's nicely framed, you know, symmetrical, not too much room at the top, not too much negative space at the bottom or either side, it's not particularly interesting, and it doesn't do any favours. This is just a black slab. So the way this is set up is about 40 degrees to the left of camera, facing the amplifier, is a velvet with a dark blue gel atop, and to the right is a Velvet Mini with a primary red gel. This took a long time to set up, but I think really this is just lack of experience. I gave myself enough time, and I finally got a look I was happy with. But I wanted to justify the fact it was a video. I didn't want this one to be the still. So the way I justified that was using, once again, the Philips Hue light, which really did come in handy. I had my girlfriend stand to the left of frame, holding it above, and this is the bit of blue you can see on the ridge halfway through. And as I recorded, she would move it across slowly, and as it switched across on my phone, I would switch the light to move between blue to indigo to violet to purple to red at the same rate at which she's turning it across, so it looks like it's changing allegiances halfway through and doing the same gradient as the one we can see at the bottom on the table, which I think went fairly well and is quite a unique technique to make this setup a bit more interesting, because to be honest, it needs it. I wish in retrospect I'd use what I learned after this, which is to use a dado light or some other motivated light source just to bring up the light levels in the room a bit. It's light enough, you can see what the buttons say, you can see all the details. I don't think it's overly black, but it would benefit from being brightened up just a little bit. I think that would really elevate this, to be honest. So for my fourth and final setup is of the VariCam itself, which I thought would be an interesting inclusion, being technology photography based, and it has quite a different, the VariCam has quite a different makeup of the other objects. The other objects are square and fairly regular and don't have much relief. They vary in texture and material. The last one had a brush finish, which I thought would be interesting, but this one, the VariCam, has a more rugged relief. It has buttons and switches and dials and doors and wires coming off it. It's a lot of things for light to hit off. So I think, knowing that I'd have problems before, I went into a lecture and decided I'd do a setup there because it is a much wider space, a bit more varied. In my room, as we'll go into, there wasn't enough space to make the VariCam in the mirror look interesting. So the actual setup I ended up using was just a VariCam with a velvet light with a dark blue gel and a Congo blue gel at the same time, pointing towards its left hand side. Facing it pretty much exactly into the lens is a velvet light with a primary red gel. This is shooting right into the lens, and that's catching the details in that direction. And then there I am, pretty much in the middle, about a meter away, just taking a picture of this on my Pixel 2 XL. And first of all, this is the phone I take everywhere. I bought it because the camera is supposed to be really good, and to be honest, it is. It can, especially if you use night mode, which I did in this subject. The light, the colours really pop. They really are quite. I think you could argue probably over the top, but for what I'm trying to do here, really fantastic. When there was enough light in the room already, so that all it did was just heighten what light there was and create this really nice two-tone effect. I wish, to be honest, in retrospect, I'd use portrait mode as well, just to create a background, a kind of shallow depth of focus effect. But to be honest, sometimes, because this is achieved using AI, not using another lens, it can cut off wrong images and because wrong parts of the image and put other parts in the foreground that aren't supposed to be there. So it's best just to avoid this, because the VariCam is such an oddly shaped object. So for my last setup, ever so slightly, I'll just go over what didn't work and which much more closely resembles what I had in my plan and what I intended for this last setup. I'd had a VariCam LT with a 35mm lens facing a mirror dead on a desk. Behind the mirror, where I'd have a velvet mini with a dark blue gel, which would create a blue aura around the mirror, and then the rest, everything in front of the mirror, would be lit, including the camera, by a primary red gel on a velvet mini as well. Everything in front of the mirror would be red, everything behind it would be blue, and this would create a very clear impression of where the mirror is and what part of it is being reflected. However, the red didn't bring out enough detail in the VariCam because the VariCam was such a small part of the image. Even if I used a 14mm lens, the VariCam just didn't take enough of the frame. I had this idea of pulling focus in to create a bit of movement, but this created too much camera shake and it just wasn't interesting. It was too muddy, it was too dark, so this had to be thrown out. My replacement, which I thought would be a solution, would be to angle the VariCam to the right, actually take the photo on my Pixel 2 XL, which I've mentioned has really nice colour science and really vibrant way of understanding colour and light in night mode especially. I shot the mirror, and this created a much nicer image where it was very clear what was mirror and what was behind it. There was a really nice contrast, really punchy reds, really deep blues. However, this, again, it was a confusing image to look at. You didn't immediately know what you're supposed to be looking at, where was what. And it wasn't clear that the subject was the Varicam either. And to be honest, this had to be scrapped as well. I am very pleased with the simplicity, even though I've lost my gimmick of having a mirror, the simplicity of the one I actually ended up using in this assignment, I think, far outshines what I tried to do with this, because at least the light hits it, it brings out the details on the left-hand side. The red is also very vibrant.